The bell above the door jingled as Harold Mitchell pushed his way into Earl's gas grocery, the smell of fresh brewed coffee cutting through the familiar haze of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Outside, the first golden rays of sunrise caught the dust on his Ford pickup, turning 30 years of honest ranch work into something almost holy. "Same as yesterday, Earl. Coffee black as midnight, and none of that fancy creamer stuff." Harold's voice came out gravelly but strong, worn by weather and cigarettes, but not by doubt. His weathered hands counted out exact change from a leather wallet gone soft with age and use, each dime and nickel placed with precision born of a lifetime of careful accounting. Earl nodded, reaching for the largest cup. "Hot as blazes today already, calling for 95 by noon." Harold grunted acknowledgement. At 67, he'd stopped bothering with weather complaints. Seen enough summers to know complaining never cooled a single one. His eyes caught something out of place, a black sedan with government plates parked near the pumps, and there on the counter an envelope with his name typed in official-looking print. "That come for me?" he asked, gesturing with his chin toward the envelope, while his nostrils flared slightly at the intrusion of unfamiliar cologne mixing with the comforting scents of the morning ritual. Earl looked uncomfortable. "Man left it 'bout 5 minutes ago, said he'd be seeing you real soon." Harold's fingers closed around the envelope, paper crisp and white against skin browned and creased like the hills surrounding his land. Harold Mitchell drove the post maul down with practiced precision, the satisfying thunk echoing across the pasture as the fence post sank another inch into Montana soil. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, despite the morning cool, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the dew that sparkled on yellowing grass. His breath fogged slightly in the air. September mornings still carried a bite this high up. At 67, Harold's shoulders weren't what they once were, but his technique made up for what time had stolen from his strength. 43 years working this same land had taught him how to coax cooperation from both wood and earth. He paused, testing the post with a firm shake, nodding with satisfaction as it held steady. The distant lowing of cattle drifted on the breeze, his small herd grazing contentedly on the north slope. Harold wiped his brow with a faded bandana, his eyes automatically scanning the fence line for the next section needing attention. Ranch work was never done, just temporarily interrupted. The unfamiliar sound cut through the morning quiet, tires crunching on the gravel drive, an engine too smooth to be local. Harold's spine stiffened before his mind had fully processed the intrusion. His hand moved instinctively to his hip, where he'd carried a sidearm during his time as a deputy before ranch life claimed him for good. He turned slowly, deliberately, watching as dust billowed around a black government sedan with Montana plates. The car came to a stop, and Harold's arthritic knee tightened as he straightened himself to full height. The pain shot sharp, but he kept his face impassive, years of practice at not showing weakness. The car door opened with a well-oiled creak that seemed almost obscene against the honest sounds of the ranch. A man in a suit stepped out, manila envelope in hand, his polished shoes already gathering dust. He looked about 40, with the confident stride of someone who believed papers and regulations trumped sweat and sacrifice. Harold set his hammer down with careful precision rather than dropping it, a small act of control when he felt anything but. "Been expecting you'd find your way here eventually," Harold called across the yard, his voice steady despite the sudden dryness in his throat. "Question is, why now?" The man approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell? Harold Mitchell? I'm Thomas Larson, representing the Bureau of Land Management." Harold crossed his arms, boots planted firmly in soil. His family had worked for 3 generations. Well, don't just stand there like a fence post. State your business or get back in that fancy car. Doreen's diner hummed with the familiar sounds of small-town commerce. Coffee cups clinking against saucers, the sizzle of the grill, newspaper pages turning with papery whispers. The lunch rush had ebbed, leaving the regulars to their coffee and conversation. Harold sat in his usual booth by the window, the government notice spread on the table beside his half-empty cup. Doc Wilson slid into the seat opposite him without invitation, his weathered doctor's hands wrapping around a fresh mug of coffee. At 72, Wilson had been treating everything from calf scours to childbirth in the county for nearly 4 decades. "Harold," he said quietly, glancing at the official letterhead, "my cousin in Denver handles these kinds of cases. Government can't just take what's yours based on some surveyor's mistake from 50 years back." Harold nodded slightly, the only acknowledgement he'd allow himself. "Appreciate that, Doc. Might need to use him." From 2 booths over, Frank Delaney's voice carried with deliberate volume. "Should have sold that land when Miller made you the offer last spring. Now look at the pickle you're in." Frank had been trying to expand his own operation for years, eyeing Harold's water rights with poorly disguised interest. His sympathy came wrapped in sandpaper. Harold's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on the documents, digesting the bureaucratic language that somehow claimed the mineral rights on his property had never been properly transferred in the 1940 sale to his father. "They're saying the original survey was incorrect," Harold said, addressing Doc, but aware of the listening ears throughout the diner. "Claiming a 30-foot shift in the property line means the government retained the mineral rights on the north section." "Convenient timing, what with the oil exploration starting up county-wide," Doc observed, his voice low. Around them, the diner had grown noticeably quieter. Conversations paused as neighbors absorbed this latest example of government overreach. Whispers rose and fell like wind through prairie grass. "BLM did the same thing to the Johnsons over in Cody last year," offered Bill Hayes from the counter stool, turning to face them. "Tied 'em up in court till they couldn't afford to fight no more." "Ain't the first time they tried to run roughshod over folks round here," Harold replied, folding the papers with deliberate care. "Won't be the last, neither." Margie, the young waitress, approached with a fresh pot of coffee. She refilled Harold's cup without asking, her movements efficient but gentle. "On the house today, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly. When Harold looked up questioningly, she added, "Dad still talks about how you helped us keep our place when the bank came calling after Mom died." Harold nodded once, the memory of co-signing a loan for Jim Tanner 15 years back, requiring no comment. That's just what neighbors did. As Margie moved away, Frank's voice rose again. "Government's got deep pockets and all the time in the world, Harold. A man your age ought to consider if this is the hill you want to die on." The diner fell silent, the challenge hanging in the air. Harold took a slow sip of his coffee, set the cup down carefully, and met Frank's gaze across the room. "Some things are worth fighting for, Frank," he said evenly. "Might be you forgot that." The last light of day filtered through stained glass, painting the empty church in hushed blues and ambers. Harold sat alone in the back pew, the same spot he'd occupied every Sunday since returning from Korea in '55. The government notice lay spread beside him on the polished wood, its official seals and signatures stark against the warm grain. Outside, crickets had begun their evening chorus, their sound drifting through an open window along with the scent of cooling earth. The building stood empty, save for Harold, Pastor Miller having nodded respectfully before retreating to the parsonage after evening prayers. Harold's calloused finger traced the wood grain of the pew, following a pattern he knew by heart. His grandfather had helped build this church in 1897, the same year he'd established the Mitchell Ranch. The same strong hands that had hewn these pews had built the homestead Harold still occupied. "Damned bureaucrats," he muttered, then glanced upward with a grimace. Pardon the language. His mind drifted to 1934, when drought had turned the county to dust, and his father had stood on their porch, facing the bank representative. "Mitchell men don't leave," his father had said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Not while there's breath in our bodies and hope in the sky." Somehow they'd survived that drought, and the one in '56, and the hard winter of '68 that had killed half the cattle in the county. Each time, his father had come to this same church, sat in this same pew, and found the strength to continue. Harold's eyes closed, the weight of his 67 years pressing down like the maul on a fence post. The ranch wasn't just land, it was his heritage, his purpose, the legacy he'd planned to leave his son if the boy ever showed interest in coming home from that fancy job in Seattle. "Lord," Harold said softly, his voice barely disturbing the silence, "you know I ain't much for asking, but I need some direction here." The church remained silent, offering no thunderbolt of guidance. Just the familiar smell of old hymnals and furniture polish, the creak of the building settling, the distant church bell marking the hour. Harold breathed deeply, and in that breath found something solid. Not an answer, perhaps, but a foundation. His boots made hollow sounds on the wooden floor as he stood, his knees protesting the movement. With deliberate care, he folded the government notice and tucked it into his pocket. The decision settled into him not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of sunrise. He would fight, not because he knew he would win, but because surrender wasn't in his blood. He squared his shoulders and walked toward the door, his stride purposeful despite the pain in his knee. "Well, that's that," he muttered as he stepped into the cooling evening air. "Can't change the wind, but I can adjust my sails." Dawn found Harold Mitchell at his kitchen table instead of the barn. November light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows across the surface where legal papers had replaced the farm ledger as his morning companion. 2 months into the fight, his kitchen had transformed into a war room, manila folders stacked by date, court precedents highlighted in yellow, property maps thumb-tacked to the wall. Harold squinted through reading glasses that hung from his neck on a cord fashioned from an old bootlace, a reluctant concession to age he'd finally made after too many headaches from straining to read the government's fine print. The glasses slid down his nose as he leaned forward, pushing them back with a roughened finger. The answering machine beside him, Doc Wilson's Christmas gift after Harold missed 3 calls from the lawyer, blinked its red light accusingly. He eyed it with the same wariness he'd once reserved for skittish bulls. Technology had never been his ally, but he'd learned to press the right buttons, even programming the damn thing after Jamie Peters had shown him twice. "Message 1, the machine announced in its flat, mechanical voice. Harold cocked his head, pen poised over the yellow legal pad where he'd developed his own shorthand for tracking the case. The clipboard mounted beside the phone held a list of questions in his careful block printing, a script for calls with the Denver lawyer. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Robert Tillman returning your call. I've reviewed the survey documents you sent over. If you could call me back at—" Harold jotted the number and time, already mentally rearranging his day. The cattle would need to wait another hour. Paper battles had pushed themselves to the front of the chore line. The coffee pot gurgled in the background, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma at 10 a.m. instead of 5. Another change to rhythms established over decades. Late nights poring over legal texts had pushed his mornings later, the unfamiliar smell of midday coffee, a reminder of how much had shifted. "Used to be a man's word was enough," he muttered, sorting papers into his filing system, a method that made perfect sense to him, though it had baffled the lawyer's secretary. "Now, everything's got to be in triplicate." Yet for all his grumbling, Harold found an unexpected precision in himself, a patience for detail work that ranch life had cultivated through years of keeping breeding records and grazing rotations. His frustration remained, but alongside it grew a quiet determination that expressed itself in carefully labeled folders and annotated exhibits. Saturday afternoon stretched golden across Doc Wilson's back porch, the late autumn sun warming the weathered boards despite the November chill. Harold sat in a rocking chair that had known his weight for over 40 years, fingers working methodically through fishing tackle as Doc sorted through a box of yellowed documents pulled from his attic. "Found these last night," Doc said, passing over brittle papers bearing the same government letterhead Harold had come to recognize. "My daddy's fight with the Forest Service back in '52, different agency, same government tricks." Harold nodded, examining the documents with new expertise. Neither man looked directly at the other, their attention seemingly absorbed by their tasks. Doc organizing papers, Harold cleaning rust from fishing hooks. This was how men of their generation communicated best, side by side rather than face to face, allowing words to emerge naturally in the spaces between actions. "Your daddy won his case," Harold observed, noting the final judgment. Doc nodded, a small smile creasing his weathered face. "Took 3 years and damn near broke him, but he was stubborn as a Missouri mule." He paused, considering a faded photograph of his father standing proudly on disputed land. "My daddy always said, government's like a bad back. Gonna give you trouble, but you learn to live with it." The porch steps creaked, announcing a visitor. Jamie Peters bounded up, his 19-year-old energy seemingly out of place in the measured rhythm of the afternoon. The boy carried a laptop, a sight as foreign on Doc's porch as a spaceship. "Mr. Mitchell," Jamie nodded respectfully. "Found something at the library you might want to see." Harold eyed the computer with suspicion, but motioned the boy over. Their unlikely alliance had formed 3 weeks prior, when Jamie, home from his first semester at Montana State, had overheard Harold struggling with the county clerk about accessing old records. "Got the mineral rights records for all the properties that bordered the old Henderson place," Jamie explained, opening the laptop and navigating with the easy confidence of his generation. "The government's claim about that survey error doesn't match what they told the Wilkes family in '62. Harold leaned forward, squinting at the screen despite his instinctive resistance to the technology. Pride warred briefly with practicality before the latter won out. "Show me," he said simply, making room for Jamie to sit. As the young man explained his findings, Doc watched with quiet amusement, the generational bridge forming before his eyes, necessity overcoming Harold's lifelong technophobia. The phone rang inside, and Doc excused himself. When he returned, his expression held a hint of surprise. "That was your boy, Harold. Said he's thinking of coming out for Christmas. Wanted to know if you'd need any help with the legal business." Harold's hands stilled on the fishing lure, his face giving away nothing, though something shifted behind his eyes. His son's calls had increased from their usual twice-yearly obligation to weekly check-ins since the legal battle began. "Always figured I'd fight my own battles," Harold said finally, returning his attention to the fishing tackle. "Takes some getting used to, having folks in your corner." The conversation ebbed, giving way to the comfortable silence of men who had known each other long enough that words weren't always necessary. The sun dipped lower, painting the distant mountains in purple shadow. No one moved to go inside. Some moments didn't need filling. They just needed witnessing. The town hall's wooden benches groaned under the weight of the crowd. Every rancher and farmer within 50 miles packed shoulder to shoulder in the stuffy room. Government representatives from the Bureau of Land Management sat at a folding table up front, their pressed shirts and official folders looking out of place among the weathered faces and calloused hands of the community. Harold sat near the back, papers neatly arranged beside him, pulse quickening, as the regional director concluded his presentation on clarifying historical land claims. The clinical language disguised what everyone present understood. The government was reaching back through time to claim what others had worked for generations. The director adjusted his glasses. We'll now take questions and comments from community members. A rustling of anticipation moved through the crowd. Harold felt eyes turning toward him, the test case, the first domino that might fall or stand firm. His hand rose almost of its own accord. "Mr. Mitchell," the director acknowledged, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. Harold rose slowly, his knees protesting as he straightened to his full height. He'd spent 3 evenings preparing his statement, the carefully written notes now folded in his pocket. His throat tightened as he faced the room, a lifetime of avoiding public speaking suddenly confronting him. He cleared his throat once, then again, aware of Frank Delaney's barely concealed smirk from across the aisle. His fingers touched the paper in his pocket, then moved away. Some things needed to come from memory, not paper. "My grandfather came to this valley in 1897, Harold began, his voice initially unsteady, but finding strength with each word. "He built the house I still live in, with timber he cut and milled himself. When he died, my father took over. When my father passed, it came to me." He stood straighter than he had in months, his gaze steady on the government officials who suddenly seemed younger, less certain. "Been on that land 67 years, paid taxes on every acre, worked every field, maintained every fence line." His voice had found its rhythm now, the cadence of a man who knew the worth of his words. "Government men come and go, but some things ought to stand the test of time." Heads nodded around the room, even from those who'd previously kept their opinions guarded. Harold continued, recounting how local families had weathered dust bowls and blizzards, market crashes and floods, always with the land as their constant. "Your papers tell one story," he said, gesturing to the officials' documents, "but our lives tell another, and I aim to make sure our story gets heard." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, the tension breaking as Harold's words found their mark. Even Frank Delaney nodded grudgingly, the shared heritage of land temporarily outweighing old rivalries. As Harold took his seat, shoulders squared and hand steady, he caught Doc Wilson's approving nod from across the room. The battle was far from won, but for the first time since the government sedan had appeared in his driveway, Harold felt the ground solid beneath his feet, not just his own private acreage, but the common ground of communities standing firm together. Sunday morning light spilled across Harold's kitchen table, warming the scattered seed catalogs open to pages of heirloom tomatoes and drought-resistant corn. The calendar on the wall showed March 15th circled in red, the final court date. But for once, Harold wasn't fixating on it. Instead, he stirred a spoonful of sugar into his coffee, a small luxury he rarely allowed himself. The radio murmured from the windowsill, Pastor Miller's Sunday sermon floating through the kitchen. Usually, Harold kept the radio tuned to the weather and cattle prices, ignoring the sermon program. But today he found himself nodding along as the pastor spoke about perseverance. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like Montana, was the letter from his attorney. Preliminary ruling favorable, It stated, in careful legalese, that Harold had read so many times he'd memorized it. The judge had questioned the government's evidence about the disputed survey lines, suggesting their case had significant procedural deficiencies. Harold sipped his sweetened coffee, savoring both the taste and the moment. 4 months of legal battles had yielded something tangible, not victory yet, but the first real sign that his fight wasn't hopeless. "Might even fix up the north pasture fence," he said aloud to the empty kitchen, his voice echoing slightly. "Been meaning to do that going on 3 years now." On the table, beside the seed catalogs, lay a half-finished letter to his son, inviting him to visit for longer than the rushed Christmas stay, when Michael had flown in for 3 days, helped organize legal files, and flown back to Seattle. This time Harold had written, maybe they could take a few days to fish the creek like they used to. Plans. He was making plans again, something he hadn't done since the government car had appeared in his driveway. It felt like slipping into an old, comfortable pair of boots, familiar and right. He didn't notice how the court date on the calendar cast a long shadow across the table as the morning sun shifted. The courthouse clock struck noon, its resonant tones floating over the gathered crowd on the granite steps. Harold stood motionless, the amended ruling trembling almost imperceptibly in his weathered hands. Around him, the world continued its indifferent rhythm, traffic passing on the street below, pigeons squabbling over crumbs, county workers hurrying to lunch appointments. "I don't understand," Harold said finally, his voice tight. "Last month they said, 'The government filed a supplementary brief,'" Robert Tillman explained, his Denver legal polish at odds with the county courthouse surroundings. "They've introduced new evidence regarding the original mineral rights transfer in the 1946 sale to your father." Harold's eyes scanned the document again, legal terminology swimming before him. "In plain English, Robert." Tillman adjusted his tie uncomfortably. "They're claiming the mineral rights were explicitly excluded from the original sale to your father. There was apparently a clause in the contract that retained subsurface rights for the government in perpetuity." "That's horseshit," Harold said flatly. "My father would never have signed such a thing. The judge has given the claim significant weight because they've produced a document with what appears to be your father's signature," Tillman continued, lowering his voice. "We'll need to hire a handwriting expert to contest it, but that's going to take time and money." Harold removed his hat, an unconscious gesture of respect toward his father's memory, and ran a hand through his thinning hair. The uncharacteristic motion betrayed more distress than any words could have. "The ruling essentially reverses our preliminary victory," Tillman concluded. "We're back to square one, with the additional burden of disproving this new evidence." Across the plaza, Harold caught sight of Thomas Larson, the BLM representative, sliding into a black government sedan, the satisfaction on his face visible even at a distance. The sight sent a spike of pain through Harold's chest, an old reminder of shrapnel fragments the Korean doctors hadn't been able to remove. Doc Wilson approached, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "We'll figure something out, Harold. These things have a way of working themselves out." The platitude rang hollow, especially coming from Doc, who usually avoided empty reassurances. Other neighbors gathered around, offering contradictory advice. "You should appeal immediately. Better to negotiate a settlement while you can. My cousin in Billings knows a specialist who—" The cacophony of well-intentioned voices blurred into meaningless noise as bile rose in Harold's throat. He swallowed hard, maintaining the rigid composure that had seen him through war, drought, and the death of his wife. 50 years working that land," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the courthouse bustle, "and some pencil pusher who's never seen it gets to decide." The paper in his hand was just paper, but it felt heavier than all the fence posts he'd ever driven combined. The storm broke over the ranch just after sunset, rain lashing against the windows like something alive and angry. Thunder rattled the glass in rhythm with the doubts battering Harold's mind. 3 days had passed since the courthouse steps. 3 days of unanswered phone calls and mail piling up on the kitchen table. The Bible that usually sat by his evening chair remained closed, its leather cover gathering dust. Harold couldn't bring himself to open it, couldn't reconcile its promises of justice with the mockery unfolding in the county courthouse. His boots tracked mud across the usually immaculate floor as he moved from window to kitchen, not bothering to clean up after himself. The sink held unwashed dishes from meals he barely remembered eating, another break in lifelong habits of military precision. The phone rang again, the 5th time that evening. Harold stared at it until it stopped, then yanked the cord from the wall. The sudden silence felt like relief. He reached for the top shelf of the pantry, pushing aside his mother's preserved peaches to find the bottle of whiskey kept for medicinal purposes. Harold had never been much of a drinker, had seen too many good men lose themselves to the bottle. But tonight, the rules that had governed his life seemed distant and irrelevant. The liquid burned his throat, unfamiliar and harsh. He didn't bother with a glass, another broken rule in a week of unraveling. On the mantel, family photographs watched him, his father standing proud beside the first tractor they'd owned, his mother on the porch with canned goods from her garden, Harold and Sarah on their wedding day, Michael as a boy holding his first fish. Generations of Mitchells who had poured their lives into land that might now be stolen with the stroke of a pen. "What was it all for?" Harold asked the empty room, his father's old expression slipping out. "Whole life working and nothing to show." Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the room in harsh white light. The thunder followed immediately, rattling the windows in their frames like God himself was demanding entrance. "You listening up there?" Harold's voice rose, addressing the ceiling, the storm, whatever might be beyond it. "Because I sure don't hear anything coming back." The storm offered no answer, just more rain and wind and thunder that mirrored the chaos he'd kept contained for 70 years. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Harold felt truly alone, not just solitary, which he'd always found comfortable, but profoundly isolated, cut off from both heaven and earth. Doreen's diner hummed with the muted conversations of the Wednesday morning crowd, the usual farmers and ranchers gathering for coffee and information exchange. The booth by the window, Harold's regular spot, sat conspicuously empty, though Margie had placed a coffee cup there anyway, a hopeful gesture growing more forlorn as the weeks passed. "Tried to get him to come in for a checkup," Doc Wilson was saying, stirring his coffee without really seeing it. "Man's blood pressure's probably through the roof. Wouldn't even open the door, just hollered through it that he was fine and to leave him be." Jamie Peters slouched in his chair, the frustration of youth evident in his restless movements. "I drove out there with those records I found in Billings, thought they might help. He wouldn't even take them, said he was done wasting time on lost causes." "That doesn't sound like Harold," Doreen said, refilling coffee cups with practiced efficiency. She paused, glancing toward the empty booth. "My daddy lost our place back in '62. Railroad claimed they had rights to run track through what had been our orchard for 40 years. Changed him. Man can take only so many hits before something breaks." The diner fell quiet, the memory of other defeats hanging in the air. Foreclosures during the '80s farm crisis, water rights battles, corporate ranching squeezing out family operations generation by generation. "Should we try again?" Jamie asked, looking to the older men for guidance. Maybe if we all went out there. Frank Delaney shook his head, surprising everyone given his usual antagonism toward Harold. Man's got a right to lick his wounds in private. Don't mean we stop watching out for him. The younger men looked confused by this apparent contradiction, but the older ranchers nodded in understanding. There was a code among men of their generation: respect another's privacy while maintaining vigilance from a distance. "I'll drop by tomorrow with some of that stew he likes," Doreen decided, her tone brooking no argument. "Won't expect him to talk. Just leave it on the porch, if that's all he'll allow." Outside, spring rain fell steadily, turning the streets to mud and washing away the last patches of snow. Inside, Margie refilled the cup at the empty booth for the third time that morning, pouring out the cold coffee and replacing it with fresh, an act of faith that Harold Mitchell would eventually return to claim his place. Harold woke with a start, disoriented by the unfamiliar angle of light streaming through barn slats, painting stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Dawn. He'd spent the night in the barn, fallen asleep against a stack of feed bags, like some vagrant rather than the property owner. His mouth tasted foul, his joints screamed in protest as he straightened, and the stubble on his face had crossed from neglect into something wilder. A discarded horseshoe nail dug into his palm as he pushed himself upright. Dust motes danced in the light beams, swirling with his movement like disturbed ghosts. The ranch had grown too quiet these past weeks, no radio playing in the kitchen, no phone ringing, just the occasional lowing of neglected cattle that neighbors had taken to feeding. Harold caught his reflection in the tarnished mirror hanging beside the tack wall, an old thing Sarah had banished from the house years ago. For a moment, he didn't recognize the haggard stranger staring back. Bloodshot eyes, unkempt gray hair, clothes rumpled from too many days' wear. He looked like the town drunk, not Harold Mitchell, whose fence lines were the straightest in the county. "Christ almighty," he muttered, touching his face as if to verify the reflection was truly his. The old horse trough still held water from yesterday's brief rain. Harold bent stiffly, splashing his face with cold water that shocked his system back toward something resembling normal human function. The ritual of washing, even in this crude form, felt like the first sane act he'd performed in weeks. Water dripped from his chin as he straightened, some animal part of his brain responding to the familiar routine of morning ablutions. He moved with deliberate care toward the workbench, where he began straightening tools that had been carelessly tossed aside during his spiral, another small step toward order. The barn drawer screeched in protest as he pulled it open, searching for a clean rag. Instead, his fingers found cool metal, his father's pocket watch, forgotten since he'd removed it while mending tack months earlier. Harold pulled it out, wiping dust from its face with his thumb. The inscription inside the cover had worn thin from decades of handling. "Hard times don't last, hard men do, 1933. His father had received it from his own father during the darkest days of the Depression, when 3 consecutive failed harvests had nearly broken them. Something shifted in Harold's chest, a tectonic movement of memory and identity. 3 generations of Mitchells had faced down disaster on this same patch of earth. None had surrendered. "This ain't who we are," he said aloud to the empty barn, the sound of his voice strange after weeks of near silence. A barn swallow swooped through the open door, unconcerned with human crises. Harold tucked the watch into his pocket, its weight familiar against his hip. He moved with growing purpose to the shelf where he kept his old shaving kit, the straight razor still sharp despite disuse. The routine came back without thought, soap worked to lather, blade against skin with practiced precision. Each stroke revealed more of the man he recognized, less of the stranger from the mirror. "Mitchell men don't quit," he told his reflection, as it emerged from beneath weeks of neglect. "We might get knocked down, but we get back up." When he finished, Harold gathered the scattered legal papers that had migrated to the barn during his darkest moments. The government's case suddenly seemed less like an insurmountable wall and more like another fence that needed mending. Difficult work, but not impossible. The Ford pickup protested with each turn of the key, the engine coughing like an old man reluctant to leave a warm bed. Harold waited, trying again, hearing the battery strain against months of minimal use. On the fourth attempt, the engine caught, settling into an uneven idle that smoothed as Harold gave it gas. "Still some life in both of us," he murmured, patting the dashboard with calloused fingers. The road into town stretched empty beneath a clear April sky, the landscape showing the first green hints of spring. Harold drove with the window down, letting the fresh air blow away the stale atmosphere that had surrounded him for weeks. From the coat hook behind the seat, he'd retrieved his good hat, the Stetson reserved for church and special occasions, and placed it firmly on his head before leaving the ranch. The truck rattled over the cattle guard that marked his property line, the sound like a door closing on the dark period he was leaving behind. Harold's jaw tightened as he passed the no trespassing signs he'd posted after the government's visit, but his resolve remained steady. His first stop wasn't the diner where neighbors would ask questions, or Doc Wilson's office where concern would be wrapped in medical advice. Instead, Harold parked outside the county library, a place he'd rarely visited since school days. Jamie Peters looked up from the reference desk, surprise washing over his young face as Harold approached, standing straighter than he had in months, making deliberate eye contact. "Mr. Mitchell," Jamie said cautiously, "good to see you." "Need some help," Harold said, the words coming out clipped but clear. "Those records you mentioned, still got 'em?" Jamie nodded quickly, almost knocking over his coffee in his eagerness. "Yes, sir, and I found more. Been organizing them, just in case." Harold settled at a study table as Jamie spread out documents, explaining his findings in a low voice. The legal dictionary beside them grew dog-eared as Harold repeatedly consulted it, methodically building his understanding of terms that had previously swum meaninglessly before his eyes. By noon, Harold had filled a notebook with concise observations, his handwriting growing steadier with each page. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance, but in his approach, systematic where he had been overwhelmed, focused where he had been scattered. Outside the library, Harold paused at the payphone, fishing coins from his pocket. He dialed Doc Wilson's number from memory. "It's Harold," he said, when the familiar voice answered. "Coming by later, if that offer still stands." He didn't explicitly mention which offer, the medical checkup, the legal contacts, the fishing invitation, but the acknowledgement of all of them hung in the air between the words. Back in the truck, Harold switched on the radio for the first time in weeks, letting the local station's familiar chatter fill the cab. At the ranch, he walked directly to the answering machine, deleted the full message bank with one button press, and recorded a new outgoing message in a voice that sounded more like himself than he'd expected. "Mitchell residence, leave a message. I'll call back." Simple, direct, a promise he intended to keep. The threshold between his porch and kitchen seemed suddenly significant, a boundary between the man he'd temporarily become and the one he'd always been. Harold crossed it with deliberate steps. "Been feeling sorry for myself long enough," he said to the empty house, his voice steady. "Time to get back in the saddle." By the end of April, Harold's kitchen had transformed into an impromptu legal headquarters that would have impressed military strategists. The kitchen table disappeared beneath neatly arranged file folders, each labeled in Harold's precise block printing. Across the wall stretched a hand-drawn timeline on butcher paper, tracking land ownership from the original 1897 homestead claim through each subsequent transfer, with red marks indicating disputed points. The military precision of the operation reflected Harold's background, everything in its place, with clear purpose and organization. The chaos of his breakdown had been systematically erased, replaced by the methodical approach that had guided his life before the crisis. When Doreen arrived with a casserole, her third just happened to make too much delivery since Harold's reemergence. She found him installing track lighting above the timeline wall, a hardware store receipt still on the counter. "Need to see the fine print better," Harold explained, not pausing in his work. "These legal folks sure do love their footnotes." The new fixture joined other practical improvements: a bulletin board by the phone, a file cabinet rescued from the town hall surplus auction, a desk lamp with an adjustable neck. Each modification served the single-minded purpose of fighting more effectively. Neighbors who had worried from a distance now found practical ways to help. Bill Hayes took over fence repairs without being asked, leaving invoices for materials but never for labor. Jamie Peters appeared each Wednesday afternoon with library books and courthouse records. Frank Delaney, in perhaps the most surprising development, sent his oldest son over with a spare generator, just in case the power goes out and you need those papers. Harold accepted these offerings with minimal acknowledgement. A nod, a grunt of thanks, occasionally a cup of coffee offered, but never turned them away. His gratitude expressed itself not in words, but in the gradually improving condition of the ranch, evidence that their faith in his resilience hadn't been misplaced. The coffee pot seemed perpetually full, sustaining late-night research sessions that stretched past midnight. Harold had developed the habit of brewing a fresh pot at 9 p.m., the rich aroma becoming a signal to his body that the real work was just beginning. The most significant change came on a Tuesday evening when Harold dialed his son's number in Seattle, the conversation awkward but purposeful. "Need your eyes on something," Harold said after minimal pleasantries. "You always were better with contracts than me." The silence that followed carried the weight of decades of unspoken complications between father and son. Then Michael's voice, careful but pleased. "Email it to me. I'll look tonight." Harold paused only briefly before replying, "Don't know how to do that email business, but I can fax it from Doc's office tomorrow." The modern world might be forcing its way into Harold's life through necessity, but he would meet it on his own terms. Later, as moonlight spilled across the documents covering his table, Harold traced the property boundaries on the oldest map, his finger following the creek that had watered Mitchell cattle for 3 generations. "Figure it this way," he said aloud, a habit he'd developed during the solitary campaign. "Done spent my whole life protecting this land. Few more months of fighting won't kill me." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in response, counting down to the final court date that now seemed less like a death sentence and more like a battle yet to be decided. The 1937 survey clearly establishes precedent for including mineral rights in the original deed transfer, Harold stated, his index finger tracing the yellowed boundary line on the county archives map spread across the table. The county clerk nodded respectfully, no longer surprised by Harold Mitchell's newfound legal vocabulary or his methodical approach to research. 3 months into his renewed fight, Harold moved through the legal landscape with growing confidence. His weathered rancher's hands, still bearing dirt from morning chores beneath his fingernails, now handled legal briefs with the same care he once reserved for newborn calves. The disconnect between his calloused fingers and the pristine documents seemed less jarring now, as if the two worlds had begun to merge. At the courthouse records room, Harold had created a system, index cards for each legal precedent, color-coded by relevance and organized chronologically. The elderly clerk had been so impressed she'd given him his own drawer in the filing cabinet, a privilege usually reserved for attorneys. "Mr. Mitchell," she'd said, "you've been through more of these records than most lawyers I know." The Ford pickup that had once carried only ranch tools now held a leather briefcase alongside fence pliers and baling wire, a visual representation of Harold's dual existence. He'd drive from morning fence repair directly to legal meetings, the smell of cattle and hay still clinging to his clothes as he discussed easement rights and mineral claims. This afternoon found him at Elmer Kowalski's kitchen table, the 93-year-old neighbor being one of the few people still living who remembered the original land transfers of the 1940s. "Your daddy bought that north section from Jim Henderson in '46, Elmer confirmed, roomy eyes still sharp with memory. Government man came around afterward, talking about some survey adjustment, but nobody paid him much mind. Back then, a man's word and a signed paper meant something." Harold nodded, making careful notes. Elmer's testimony wouldn't hold legal weight without documentation, but it provided direction for his continued archive searches. The patience he'd cultivated through decades of ranch work, waiting out drought years, nursing sick livestock, mending endless fences, now served him well in the tedious legal process. Later that week, Bill Hancock approached Harold after church, hat literally in hand, to ask about his own boundary dispute with the Forest Service. "Heard you've been giving the government boys a run for their money," Bill said, the hope in his voice unmistakable. Harold found himself explaining filing procedures and requesting public records, skills he'd never imagined needing. He loaned Bill his legal dictionary and copied his notes on similar cases, experiencing an unexpected satisfaction in helping another rancher navigate the bureaucratic maze he'd been forced to learn. "Government's got time and money on their side," Harold told Bill as they stood in the church parking lot. "We got something better. Truth and stubbornness. Neither one runs out if you're in the right." The observation surprised Harold himself. A glimpse of wisdom he hadn't known he possessed until the words emerged, distilled from months of struggle. That evening, driving home with spring sunset painting the distant mountains purple, Harold reflected on how the crisis had transformed him. The legal battle remained uphill, but something fundamental had shifted in his approach to the fight, and perhaps to life itself. The government still held most of the cards, but Harold had found resources within himself and his community that couldn't be measured in legal briefs or tax dollars. The pneumonia struck with the sudden ferocity of a summer hailstorm. One day Harold was reviewing depositions at his kitchen table. The next he was burning with fever, each breath a struggle against the fluid filling his lungs. Doc Wilson, making a routine visit to drop off legal papers, found him semi-conscious and immediately called an ambulance. "Stubborn old coot," Doc muttered as they waited, pressing a stethoscope to Harold's chest. "Probably been walking around with this for a week." 3 days into his hospital stay, Harold lay propped against starched pillows, an IV line snaking from his arm, legal papers spread across the blanket despite the nurse's protests. His weathered fingers, now sporting an oxygen monitor clip, tapped impatiently against the metal bed rail as he listened to Robert Tillman on the speakerphone. "They've moved up the court date, Harold," the lawyer was saying, his voice tinny through the phone speaker. "We now have 3 weeks instead of 6. Harold's tapping intensified, the only outward sign of his frustration. His face remained impassive, a skill honed through decades of poker games at the VFW hall. "Just a hiccup," "Not a surrender," he replied, voice weaker than he would have liked, but still determined. Mitchell men don't know how to quit. The reality, however, was more complicated than his brave words suggested. His handwriting had grown shakier, requiring Jamie Peters to transcribe his notes. The brief climb from bed to bathroom left him winded. The calendar was unforgiving, and his body was betraying him at the worst possible moment. As if orchestrated by some malevolent force, spring flooding had washed out the main access road to the ranch, complicating the legal team's access to his records. The kitchen headquarters he'd so carefully organized was temporarily unreachable except by the long back way through Carlson's property. On the fourth day, Michael arrived from Seattle, his city clothes and clean-shaven face a stark contrast to the rural hospital surroundings. The years of distance between father and son hung in the air, a presence as real as the antiseptic smell and mechanical beeping. "You didn't need to come," Harold said by way of greeting, the words sounding harsher than he'd intended. Michael hung his jacket precisely on the room's single hook. "Well, I'm here anyway." They existed in uncomfortable silence until a nurse arrived with medication, creating a momentary distraction. When she left, Michael spoke again, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been in contact with Robert. I can coordinate with Jamie to access the documents at the ranch while you recover." The offer was practical, necessary, and yet accepting it required Harold to acknowledge his limitations, something that had never come easily. The unspoken history between them complicated what should have been a simple exchange of assistance. "Access roads washed out," Harold said finally. "You'll need to take the back way through Carlson's place." "I remember it," Michael replied quietly. The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Of course Michael remembered. He'd grown up on that land, learned to drive on those back roads, helped maintain those fences. The knowledge had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of their estrangement. Outside the hospital window, veterans from the local VFW were organizing a work party, trucks and tractors gathering in the parking lot before heading to the Mitchell Ranch. Word had spread about Harold's illness and the approaching court date. Without being asked, they had mobilized to ensure the ranch didn't suffer during his absence. "Your friends are quite something," Michael observed, watching the gathering below. Harold nodded, a lump forming in his throat that had nothing to do with his illness. "Always been that way around here." The unspoken question hung between them. Why Michael had chosen to leave such a community. Why Harold had let him go without fighting to understand. Neither man had the vocabulary to bridge that gap, not yet, but the shared crisis had created a tentative foundation for something new. The town council chamber buzzed with anticipation, every seat filled and people standing 3 deep along the back wall. What had begun as Harold's personal battle had catalyzed something larger, a community-wide examination of land rights and government overreach. Tonight's agenda included discussion of a proposed resolution supporting local landowners in disputes with federal agencies. Harold sat near the front, still thinner from his illness, but fully recovered, Michael beside him in what had become a weekly ritual during his extended stay. The dynamic between father and son remained complex, but their shared purpose had created a working relationship that occasionally hinted at something deeper. When Mayor Thompson opened the floor for public comment, 3 landowners approached Harold before taking the microphone, seeking whispered advice on their own cases. The shift in his community standing was subtle but unmistakable. From respected but solitary rancher to reluctant authority figure, his hard-won expertise now a resource for others. The local newspaper editor had featured a front-page story on historical land ownership in the county, prompted by Harold's research. The article now hung framed in Doreen's diner, alongside a large map where affected properties had been marked in red, creating a visual representation of what many had previously seen as isolated incidents. When Harold rose to speak, the room quieted immediately. He stood straighter than he had in years, hands steady as he referenced specific statutes and precedents. The voice that had once been reserved primarily for cattle and the occasional Sunday greeting now filled the chamber with confident authority. "Ain't just about my patch of dirt anymore," he concluded, scanning the familiar faces before him. "It's about standing up for what's right. Today, it's my land. Tomorrow could be yours. We either stand together now or fall separately later." The council voted unanimously to establish a legal defense fund for landowners facing similar challenges, with Harold appointed to the Oversight Committee despite his protests that he was no politician. The irony wasn't lost on him. After decades of keeping mostly to himself, he now found himself at the center of a community movement. Wednesday strategy meetings had become a fixture at Doreen's Diner, the corner booth transformed into an information clearinghouse. Jamie Peters maintained the growing archive of relevant cases, while Doc Wilson coordinated with legal contacts in neighboring counties. Even Frank Delaney had grudgingly joined the effort, his extensive connections with state politicians proving unexpectedly valuable. Michael had extended his leave of absence from the Seattle firm, his legal background finally finding purpose in the community he'd once been so eager to escape. Harold never commented on the extension directly, but he'd cleared space in his office for Michael's laptop and files, a silent acknowledgement of his son's commitment. As the meeting concluded, Harold felt the room's energy shift when he stood to leave, conversations pausing momentarily in recognition. The weight of their collective trust settled on his shoulders, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. For a man who had measured his life in acres maintained and cattle raised, this new form of legacy was still being reconciled. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, the mail carrier hand-delivering it rather than leaving it in the box at the end of the drive. Harold recognized the Department of Justice letterhead before he even opened the envelope, his stomach tightening in anticipation. The kitchen fell silent as he read, Michael pausing his typing to watch his father's face for reaction. The only sound was the ticking of the clock that had marked Mitchell time for 3 generations. "They've transferred the case to federal court in Denver," Harold said finally, his voice neutral despite the significance of the news. "Hearing set for June 15th. Michael's brow furrowed. "That's their strategy? Moving to a bigger court to intimidate us?" "Bigger court, bigger city, bigger government," Harold confirmed, but his expression remained steady as he reached for the calendar on the wall. "Bigger loss when we win." With deliberate movements, Harold uncapped his pen and circled the date, the ink making a solid, unbroken line around the number. The sound of the pen tip against the paper seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen, a declaration of intent made physical. Where once such news would have devastated him, Harold now viewed it as merely the next fence that needed mending. Challenging, but not insurmountable. The government's attempt to escalate hadn't sparked fear, but rather a calm, focused determination. By afternoon, Harold had begun organizing carpools to Denver, calling ranchers and townspeople who had offered support. The 70-mile trip to Denver had been designed as another obstacle, but Harold transformed it into an opportunity for solidarity. "They think we'll back down because they moved it to the big courthouse," he told Jamie Peters, as they updated the case timeline. "They don't know country folks very well." The logistics of transporting supporters, arranging accommodations, and ensuring the ranch continued running in his absence became Harold's focus. Each practical step taken was a counterpoint to the government's attempt to complicate the process. That evening, Harold stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the land in golden light. The same land his grandfather had claimed, his father had improved, and he had protected for nearly 7 decades. The federal courthouse in Denver might be imposing with its marble columns and formal procedures, but it was still just a building filled with people, and Harold Mitchell had spent his entire life learning how to stand his ground, regardless of the terrain. The Denver Federal Courthouse loomed over Harold Mitchell like some vast marble monument to government power, its columns and security checkpoints a world away from the straightforward functionality of the county courthouse back home. Metal detectors and uniformed guards processed the steady stream of ranchers and townspeople who had traveled the 70 miles in a caravan of pickups and sedans, all dressed in their Sunday best. Harold removed his Stetson the moment he crossed the threshold, tucking it respectfully under his arm, a gesture from another era that drew curious glances from the urban professionals hurrying through the lobby. His arthritic knee protested each step up the wide staircase, but he kept his back straight, refusing the elevator as a small act of defiance against age and intimidation. Courtroom 3 gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures, the judge's bench elevated like an altar. Harold's people filled the benches behind him: Doc Wilson, Jamie Peters, Frank Delaney, and dozens more who had taken a day away from fields and businesses to witness the culmination of his fight. Michael sat beside him at the defendant's table, their shoulders nearly touching in a physical proximity that felt significant after years of distance. The government attorneys arranged their documents with practiced efficiency, their suits tailored and expressions confident. Thomas Larson, the BLM representative who had first appeared in Harold's driveway, leaned to whisper something to the lead attorney, his glance toward Harold carrying a hint of condescension. When Judge Eleanor Martinez entered, Harold rose smoothly despite the pain shooting through his knee, his face betraying nothing. The proceedings began with the formal recitation of case numbers and legal citations, the language as foreign to most of the ranchers present as Sanskrit. The government presented its case first, a detailed argument about survey errors, property line adjustments, and the 1946 deed that supposedly excluded mineral rights. The presentation was polished, technical, and delivered with the assurance of those accustomed to winning. When Harold's turn came, he moved to the witness stand with measured steps, placing his hand on the Bible and taking the oath in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the courtroom. Robert Tillman began the questioning, establishing Harold's history with the property and knowledge of its boundaries. Mr. Mitchell, the government contends that mineral rights were explicitly excluded from the 1946 sale to your father. How do you respond to that claim? Harold leaned slightly forward, his weathered hands resting lightly on the rail before him. My father taught me to read every word before signing. Seems the government should do the same. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Harold nodded to Michael, who approached with a document preserved in a plastic sleeve. This is the original deed my father received, kept in our family Bible since 1946. The judge accepted the document, examining it through reading glasses as Harold continued. Page 3, paragraph 2, specifically includes all mineral and subsurface rights in the transfer from the Henderson family. The government's copy conveniently omits that paragraph. The lead government attorney rose immediately. Your Honor, we question the authenticity of this document and Mr. Mitchell's recollection. Given his age and the stress of these proceedings, if you're questioning my memory, Harold interrupted, his voice level but firm, I'm happy to recite the full property description from the original survey, Beginning at the southeast corner of Section 17, Township 14 North, Range 65 West, thence north along the section line 5,280 feet to the northeast corner of said Section 17. Harold continued for nearly 2 minutes, reciting precise measurements and boundary markers without hesitation or reference to notes. The courtroom fell silent except for the steady cadence of his voice and the prominent ticking of the wall clock above the judge's bench. When he finished, even the government attorneys looked disconcerted. Judge Martinez studied him thoughtfully over her glasses before returning her attention to the deed. "The court will need time to authenticate this document," she said finally. "We'll take a 30-minute recess while I review the evidence presented." As the judge departed, Harold remained standing, his posture military straight despite the morning's strain. The uncertainty of the moment hung heavy in the air, his future suspended between the pages of a document preserved by his father's foresight and his own stubborn refusal to surrender what was rightfully his. The afternoon sun broke through clouds as Harold Mitchell emerged onto the courthouse steps, illuminating the scene in a warm golden light that seemed cinematically appropriate for the moment. Behind him, supporters spilled from the building, their excited conversations creating a buzz of energy that drew the attention of passers-by and the small cluster of reporters who had gathered to cover the David versus Goliath legal battle. Judge Martinez's ruling still rang in Harold's ears, a complex legal decision that Robert Tillman had quickly translated into layman's terms. The Mitchell property boundaries would remain intact. The government's claim of survey error was rejected based on the original deed's clear language. However, future mineral development would require environmental impact studies and partial revenue sharing with the government. A partial victory, not everything Harold had wanted, but enough to preserve what mattered most. Michael stood beside him, relief evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. "Dad, they want a statement," he said quietly, nodding toward the reporters. Harold nodded once, descending the steps with deliberate dignity to where the small media contingent waited. As cameras raised, he found himself thinking not of what he'd say, but of how far he'd come from that broken man drinking alone during a thunderstorm. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you feel about the judge's decision?" called a young reporter from the Denver Post. Harold removed his hat, holding it respectfully as he spoke. "Sometimes winning isn't getting everything you want. It's keeping what matters most." His voice carried the quiet authority he'd developed over months of speaking at community meetings, humble but satisfied, lacking both the brashness of total victory and the bitterness of defeat. "The land stays in my family, where it belongs. The government gets some say in what happens below ground, which I can live with since I never planned on oil drilling anyway." The small crowd chuckled appreciatively. As the questions continued, Harold consistently redirected personal praise toward the community effort, mentioning Jamie's research, Doc Wilson's connections, and the town's support. Even when a reporter tried to cast him as a folk hero standing against government overreach, Harold shook his head. "Wasn't just me. Couldn't have been. One fence post doesn't make a corral." Thomas Larson emerged from the courthouse, pausing awkwardly at the edge of the gathered crowd. Harold noticed him immediately and, to the surprise of many, stepped away from the reporters to approach the government representative. He extended his hand, the gesture visible to everyone present. "No hard feelings," Harold said, loud enough to be heard, but clearly meant as a private exchange. "You were doing your job. I was protecting my home." Larson hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake, genuine respect flickering across his features. "For what it's worth, Mr. Mitchell, I'm glad you get to keep your land." Only those closest to Harold, Michael and Doc Wilson, noticed the slight relaxation of his shoulders as the final tension drained away. The battle that had consumed nearly a year of his life, threatening everything he valued, had ended not in absolute triumph or devastating loss, but in something more nuanced and perhaps more valuable: mutual respect and a workable compromise. As the crowd began dispersing, Harold turned to Michael with a question he would never have asked before this journey began. "What do you think about the outcome?" The simple inquiry acknowledged his son's legal expertise and personal investment in a way that bridged decades of distance, offering a foundation for whatever might come next. The Mitchell Ranch hummed with activity as afternoon stretched toward evening. Trucks and cars parked in neat rows along the fence line, folding tables laden with potluck dishes spanning the yard. The impromptu celebration had grown organically. Doreen bringing pies, the VFW members setting up tables, neighbors arriving with food and congratulations, until it seemed half the county had gathered to mark the occasion. The ranch itself looked better than it had in years. During Harold's illness and the height of the legal battle, the community had quietly stepped in, mending fences, repainting outbuildings, ensuring the cattle were tended. What had begun as emergency assistance had evolved into a restoration project, as if in defying the government's claim on the land, they were all recommitting to its care. Harold moved through the gathering with uncharacteristic ease, decades of solitary habits softened by months of community engagement. He found himself alongside Jamie Peters near the old survey marker at the property's eastern boundary, the young man's curiosity drawing an unexpected streak of mentorship from Harold. "Grandfather placed this in 1897, Harold explained, crouching despite his knee to brush dirt from the metal disc embedded in stone. Every boundary dispute since has referenced it. That's why documentation matters. One solid point you can trust when everything else shifts." Jamie nodded, absorbing the lesson that went beyond property lines. "I've applied to law school for the fall," he said, watching Harold's face for reaction. Harold nodded approvingly. "County could use a lawyer who understands both sides of the fence." Near the house, Michael had become the center of a small gathering, his city reserve gradually giving way to more animated conversation. Harold caught fragments about opening a satellite office and spending more time back home, phrases that he filed away without comment but with quiet satisfaction. The town council president approached Harold with handshakes and congratulations, which quickly evolved into a request for Harold to serve as advisor on a new land use committee. The irony of becoming part of local government after fighting it at the federal level wasn't lost on Harold, but he found himself nodding agreement. As evening approached, someone raised the American flag on the repaired flagpole near the house, a tradition Harold had maintained until the legal battle had consumed his attention. The simple ceremony drew a moment of respectful silence before conversations resumed, now mixing with laughter as tension fully released into celebration. "Land's not just dirt and rocks," Harold observed to Doc Wilson as they watched the younger generation gathering around the bonfire someone had started. "It's history and future all in one." Doc nodded, understanding the philosophy behind the simple statement. "You've given these young folks something important, Harold. Showed them some things are worth the fight." Around them, multiple generations mingled. Jamie's college friends, middle-aged ranchers, elderly neighbors, all connected by the shared experience of standing together against a threat to their way of life. The victory was Harold's on paper, but the community had claimed it as their own, a template for facing whatever challenges might come next. The porch rocker creaked rhythmically as Harold Mitchell watched the sun sink toward the western ridge, painting his land in the rich golds and purples of a Montana evening. 3 months had passed since the courthouse steps in Denver, the seasons turning from spring's uncertainty to summer's established growth. In the distance, cattle grazed contentedly, their occasional lowing carried on the cooling breeze. The legal papers that had once dominated his kitchen table now rested in labeled folders in the office filing cabinet, their urgency replaced by seed catalogs and ranch ledgers. Yet alongside these familiar staples sat new additions, legal reference books, a subscription to a land rights newsletter, and a notebook where Harold had begun recording the story of his fight and the generations of Mitchell history that had preceded it. "Figure someone ought to know how close we came to losing it all," he murmured to himself, the habit of speaking aloud during solitary evenings persisting despite the increased human contact of recent months. Michael would be arriving tomorrow for his monthly visit, a new routine established since the case concluded. Their relationship remained a work in progress, comfortable in some moments, awkward in others, but grounded in a mutual respect that had been missing for decades. Harold's role in the community had shifted as well. People sought his advice on matters beyond land disputes, recognizing in him a well of practical wisdom that had been there all along, waiting to be tapped. He gave it sparingly but honestly, uncomfortable with, but gradually accepting this new dimension of his legacy. The rocking chair maintained its steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the evening chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. Harold's hands, still bearing the calluses of ranch work, rested comfortably on the chair arms, hands that had driven fence posts, delivered calves, signed legal briefs, and eventually shaken those of his opponents. At 68, Harold Mitchell had never expected to reinvent himself, yet the crisis that had threatened everything he valued had ultimately expanded rather than diminished his life. The land remained, the solid foundation beneath his feet, but his understanding of both it and himself had deepened immeasurably. Peace settled over the ranch as darkness gathered, not the desperate isolation of his lowest moments, but a rich, connected solitude built on knowing exactly where and who he was. Harold continued rocking, watchful but content, as the first stars appeared above the land that would remain in Mitchell hands for at least one more generation.